You wake to the sound of bronze chains shifting faintly against marble, a music of captivity that only those in bondage can truly recognize. Pale morning light filters through the tall, latticed windows of a Roman villa on the Palatine Hill, perhaps around the year 20 AD. The air is cold and carries the faint scent of wine spilled on mosaic floors during last night's banquet. Your limbs ache, not from labor in the fields, but from another kind of exhaustion, the strain of being endlessly watched, endlessly performed, endlessly consumed. At just 16, your body has already become a stage for the desires of others. Senators and equestrians reclined on couches as you poured Falernian wine into their cups, speaking of law, conquest, and philosophy, as though you were invisible. To them, you are not a boy, not a human, but a delicate ornament of the evening. They joke about your features as though discussing the flavor of olives, each word a reminder that you are both treasure and tool. It has been 4 years since a man in the slave market at Delos exchanged 40,000 sesterces for your life, a sum that could have secured land for an entire family of free citizens. Your previous master had wept when bankruptcy forced the sale, but not for you, not for your suffering. His tears were those of a merchant who had lost a prized investment. In that moment you understood that affection and cruelty can be made of the same indifference. Both see you as an object of value, not as a person. The villa around you reinforces this lesson. The marble columns are not merely supports, they are symbols, declarations of wealth and permanence. Each fresco on the wall, painted with mythological scenes, is a reminder that beauty here is not meant to comfort, but to display power. And in this household you are one more ornament, carefully polished, carefully preserved, yet entirely disposable. Rome had a word for boys like you, delicatus. In modern languages the word translates clumsily, delicate boy, youthful companion, pretty slave. None of these phrases capture the weight it bore in Roman society. It was not only a description of fragility, but a classification within the brutal hierarchy of servitude. You were expected to be refined yet pliant, adorned yet obedient, visible yet voiceless. This paradox, that you are both elevated above other slaves and at the same time stripped of any agency, creates an atmosphere more suffocating than iron shackles. You may wear silk while others wear rough wool, dine on delicacies while others chew coarse barley bread, and sleep near your master rather than in the cellar. But every luxury is a chain in disguise, for your body is the true property being displayed. In the chill of morning you recall fragments of last night's feast, the poet's verses recited to laughter, the flicker of oil lamps on gilded cups, the way a guest's hand lingered too long when passing you a dish. Rome's elite like to imagine themselves inheritors of Greek refinement, patrons of art and philosophy, but their entertainments are underpinned by the silent presence of slaves who are both audience and performance. Outside, the city stirs. Vendors shout in the forum, bakers open their shops, legionaries tramp toward their posts. To them, this villa represents stability and order. Yet within its decorated walls, hidden lives unfold, lives of boys and girls who are trained, adorned, and broken in silence. The paradox deepens. Rome prides itself on libertas, freedom as the highest civic virtue, while its very foundation rests on those denied even the most basic autonomy. You know this contradiction too well. You have lived it each day since the moment the auctioneer's hand sealed your fate. And as you rise to prepare for another day in service, the marble floor biting cold against your bare feet, you carry in your body a truth the senators outside will never admit, that the grandeur of Rome is built upon bones as much as stone, upon silence as much as rhetoric. This is where our story begins, not in the victories of emperors or the triumphal arches that still stand, but in the quiet suffering of those whose names were rarely recorded, whose beauty was both weapon and curse, whose mornings began like yours, in the uneasy stillness between luxury and despair. The Romans were masters of language, yet sometimes their words concealed as much as they revealed. Among the vast vocabulary of slavery, few terms carried as much ambiguity and as much cruelty as delicatus. To modern ears it sounds almost gentle, fragile, even affectionate, the delicate one. But in the Roman world it was never meant as tenderness. It was classification, a label that pinned a boy to a specific station in the hierarchy of servitude. A delicatus was not simply a household slave. He was trained, displayed, and consumed as a rare luxury. Roman society had elaborate systems for categorizing slaves: agricultural laborers, gladiators, household attendants, scribes. Each role meant a different kind of degradation. An agricultural slave bent his back in the fields, breaking his body against stone-hard soil under the Mediterranean sun. His life expectancy was short, his days filled with relentless toil. By contrast, the life of a delicatus was polished, perfumed, and dressed in silk. But this elevation was its own kind of destruction, for it demanded not strength, but surrender. The philosopher Seneca the Younger wrote bitterly of the moral corruption he saw in Rome's households, where young slaves were treated as both ornaments and outlets. He described how aristocrats surrounded themselves with delicati, indulging in luxuries that blurred the line between possession and pleasure. Yet even Seneca, with all his moralizing, never challenged the institution itself. He condemned excess, not the act of ownership. Other writers, like Marcus Verrius Flaccus, the imperial tutor under Augustus, emphasized the subtlety of these gradations. To truly understand Rome, he argued, one had to recognize the nuances of degradation, how a field slave differed from a house slave, how a concubinus differed from a delicatus. The distinctions were legal and social, but they all converged on the same truth: human lives converted into categories of property. Modern historians often debate whether concubinus is the more accurate term, as it directly implies a sexual relationship with a master. Yet the word delicatus is perhaps more chilling precisely because of its vagueness. It was at once a description of beauty, a sign of status, and a legal label. In its deliberate ambiguity, it erased individuality. A boy could be bought and sold not as Marcus or Lucius, but as a delicatus. His name, his past, his voice, subsumed into a title that both marked him as special and stripped him of identity. The Romans understood well the paradox they had created. To be delicate was to be desirable, but also dangerously vulnerable. Youth itself became currency. Smooth skin and graceful movement promised favor, but they also guaranteed exploitation. And when the boy's face hardened with age or his voice deepened, the very qualities that once ensured his survival would condemn him to obsolescence. In Rome's cruel arithmetic, delicacy had an expiration date. It is worth pausing here to imagine the strangeness of such a system. For a society that celebrated strength, conquest, and martial valor, the cultivation of delicacy as a commodity reveals a profound contradiction. A Roman general might boast of his legion's ferocity, yet in his villa he might prize above all a youth trained to walk softly, speak sweetly, and conceal every trace of resistance. In this tension between public hardness and private fragility, we glimpse the peculiar psychology of Roman power. This duality also reflects broader Roman values. Strength was the foundation of empire, but control was the essence of mastery. To dominate another's body so completely that he was remade into delicacy was, in a sense, the ultimate demonstration of power. For the master, the delicatus was both an object of pleasure and a mirror reflecting his wealth and authority. For the slave, it was a role to be performed flawlessly or risk punishment, sale, or abandonment. To translate delicatus as delicate boy misses all of this, the layers of status, exploitation, and expectation woven into the term. It was not just a description of fragility, it was a sentence: to live beautifully but never freely, to be seen constantly but never as oneself. And so when we speak of delicity in Rome, we must hear in the word not softness, but the brittle edge of survival. Beneath the silks and perfumes, beneath the music and laughter of Roman banquets, lay a truth that no vocabulary could fully disguise, that delicacy itself had been weaponized, turned into both the reason for a boy's preservation and the guarantee of his suffering. If there is one story that captures both the extremes and the absurdities of Rome's cruelty, it is that of Sporus. His name appears in the works of Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus, not as a poet, soldier, or philosopher, but as an unwilling actor in one of the most grotesque performances ever staged by power. Sporus was a boy who, by chance of appearance, resembled the Empress Poppaea Sabina, the wife of Emperor Nero. In 65 AD, Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked Poppaea to death while she was pregnant. The emperor's grief was real but twisted. He mourned not as a husband, but as a man who had destroyed something he believed belonged to him. And into this wound of loss he forced Sporus. Nero had the boy castrated, a practice technically outlawed under Roman law since the reign of Domitian. But emperors, elevated above the law, often treated such prohibitions as minor inconveniences. To Nero, what mattered was not legality, but desire. He dressed Sporus in the empress's clothes, installed him in her apartments, and staged a wedding ceremony complete with dowry and hymns. Senators and citizens alike were expected to address this boy as Augusta, as though Rome had acquired a new empress. To modernize the act seems unimaginable, but in Rome, where spectacle was the language of politics, it was both horrifying and theatrically logical. By remaking Sporus into Poppaea, Nero not only indulged his grief and obsession, but also flaunted his absolute power. He could turn a slave into an empress, a boy into a woman, reality into theatre. His cruelty was not hidden. It was performed before the eyes of the empire. Yet Sporus's ordeal did not end with Nero's suicide in 68 AD. Power shifted rapidly in the year of the four emperors, and with each transfer of rule, Sporus was passed along like a prize. Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect, claimed him first. Then Emperor Otho kept him as a companion during his brief reign. Even Vitellius, who soon seized power, planned to use Sporus for one final humiliation. He intended to force the boy to reenact the myth of Proserpina's rape in the arena, a public spectacle that would have been both theatre and execution. Faced with this fate, Sporus chose death. He ended his life before Vitellius's performance could be staged. He was perhaps 21 years old. The tragedy of Sporus is shocking, yet it was not an isolated cruelty. It was simply an extreme expression of a system that commodified youth, beauty, and vulnerability. Most concubines did not suffer on the imperial stage, but they lived out the same logic in quieter, daily humiliations. Sporus's story forces us to confront the naked truth of Rome, that cruelty could be dressed in ritual, violence could be paraded as ceremony, and the destruction of a life could be masked as spectacle. But it also reminds us of something more universal, that even within systems of absolute domination, human beings sought the smallest measure of control. In choosing death, Sporus denied Rome the final performance it demanded of him. His act of refusal, though born of despair, was perhaps the only freedom left to him. The poets and historians who recorded his story likely intended it as gossip, scandal, or moral warning. Yet across 2 millennia, what lingers is not Nero's excess, nor Vitellius's depravity, but the fragile outline of a boy whose life was consumed by others' power, and who in the end seized one last moment to claim his own silence. Before Sporus, before the silks and perfumes, before the rehearsed gestures at banquets, there was always the market. It was there that boys first crossed the threshold from childhood into commodity. Rome's slave markets were brutal theatres of commerce, open squares where human beings were displayed like livestock, inspected, priced, and sold beneath the gaze of potential buyers. Purchase often occurred when boys were between 7 and 14 years old. Too young, and the risk of sickness or death diminished their value. Too old, and the features of adolescence had already begun to harden into adulthood. Slave traders knew their clientele and curated their stock accordingly. Syrian and Greek boys commanded the highest prices, prized for what Romans considered the ideal combination of beauty and refinement. The inspections were invasive, systematic, and humiliating. Buyers checked teeth for signs of health, examined skin for blemishes, tested the flexibility of limbs as though evaluating a horse. A boy's voice might be listened to carefully, not for eloquence, but for its tone and pitch, since a deepening voice signaled the fleeting nature of his value. Traders emphasized youth by plucking body hair, whitening skin with powders, and applying rouge to cheeks. Innocence itself became an illusion crafted for sale. It is tempting to imagine the market as chaotic noise, but in fact it followed a choreography. Boys stood on raised platforms, sometimes wearing placards that listed their qualities, age, origin, education, or skills. Contracts were drawn up with clauses specifying future use. A boy sold without warranty could be discarded if he developed scars or lost beauty. A boy sold as sound was guaranteed for a certain period, as if he were a new amphora or an unbroken mule. The Romans believed themselves connoisseurs of human flesh. Large, dark eyes, full lips, a slender build, and a graceful walk were considered marks of desirability. These standards were not merely aesthetic, they were financial. A boy embodying them might fetch a price equivalent to the annual income of a senator. To own such a delicatus was to announce one's wealth as loudly as owning an estate or a string of racehorses. What we find most disturbing today is how normalized this spectacle was in Roman life. Families brought children to the forum where such markets were held. Philosophers strolled past stalls of chained bodies while debating ethics. Merchants haggled over the price of wheat on one side of the square, while on the other, boys stood silently, waiting for hands to prod their faces and bodies. To Rome, this was not scandal, it was commerce. And yet, if we listen carefully to the scattered sources, traces of humanity seep through. An inscription might record that a boy was purchased at 12, educated in poetry, and later manumitted by his master, small hints of lives that endured beyond the market floor. A letter preserved in papyri might describe a parent selling a child in desperation during famine. Behind each transaction there was always a family broken, a childhood erased, a person reshaped into property. The market was where the illusion of privilege began. To be chosen as a delicatus was, in one sense, elevation. A silk tunic instead of a rough cloak, music lessons instead of field labor. But it was also the moment the boy's fate was sealed. The same features that protected him from the mines condemned him to another kind of violence, less visible but no less devastating. And so the market must be remembered not only as the starting point of a concubine story, but as a mirror of Rome itself, a civilization that saw beauty and immediately thought of ownership, that recognized delicacy and immediately sought to consume it. In that square where coins clinked and contracts were signed, Rome revealed what it valued most and whom it valued least. Once a boy left the market and entered a Roman household, his transformation began in earnest. Purchase was only the first step. Refinement was the true investment. The master who had paid a fortune for a delicatus expected not only beauty but polish, and so training commenced immediately. The body was the first canvas. A concubine learned to move with grace, to walk with a measured softness that suggested both innocence and availability. Posture mattered, shoulders relaxed, steps light, eyes lowered but not sullen. Every gesture was rehearsed until it seemed natural. The Romans admired artifice, but only when the performance was invisible. Music and dance soon followed. A boy might be taught to play the lyre or flute, not for his own joy, but to charm guests at dinner parties. He learned to sing in both Latin and Greek, his voice shaped into tones that soothed or delighted depending on the occasion. Dance was another essential skill, controlled, fluid, sensual, yet always poised within the limits of decorum. The movements were choreographed to project reluctant allure, the paradox Rome demanded, a slave trained to appear both unwilling and irresistible. But the mind, too, was cultivated. Education was a mark of luxury in Rome, and masters often paraded the intelligence of their concubines as they would a rare gem. Poetry was a central discipline. Boys memorized lines of Catullus, Tibullus, or Virgil, reciting verses at the master's command. Quick wit was prized. Knowing when to offer a clever remark and when to remain silent could determine a boy's survival at the dinner table. Conversation was an art form, and the concubine was expected to master it as deftly as song. Some households went further, providing instruction in philosophy, mathematics, or rhetoric. Plutarch even mentions a concubine capable of discussing Stoic philosophy while pouring wine, a boy turned into both entertainer and intellectual accessory. Yet even here, learning was never for the boy's sake. Knowledge was currency that reflected the wealth of the master, not the freedom of the slave. A concubine might recite Plato, but he was forbidden to apply those lessons to his own life. This education was not universal. Many concubines received only enough instruction to perform basic duties with elegance. But the principle remained the same. Every refinement served the master's prestige. At banquets, guests admired not only the delicacy of the wine or the brilliance of the silverware, but also the grace of the boy who poured the drink, the elegance of his words, the refinement of his gestures. Yet behind these displays lay constant tension. Too much wit could be seen as insolence, too much knowledge could be perceived as threat. The concubine had to perform intelligence without ever suggesting independence, to sparkle without outshining the master. It was a dangerous balance, one that demanded not just obedience, but an almost theatrical sensitivity to mood and circumstance. And so training became survival. A misstep could mean humiliation, punishment, or sale. Success, on the other hand, meant security, perhaps better food, gentler treatment, or even, in rare cases, the possibility of manumission. But the boy always knew that this success was fragile, resting not on his humanity, but on his ability to please. The Romans often claimed they admired Greek ideals of paideia, the cultivation of body, mind, and spirit. But in the case of the delicatus, this noble philosophy was twisted into a weapon. The body was shaped for beauty, the mind sharpened for amusement, the spirit harnessed for obedience. The result was not a free man, but a perfected possession, a living ornament whose every song, every verse, every step was choreographed to reflect his master's power. If training shaped the concubine's mind and movements, then daily maintenance transformed his body into a polished artifact. Beauty was never assumed, it was manufactured through hours of grooming that blurred the line between luxury and torment. In the Roman household, the concubines' day began not with freedom of choice, but with ritual preservation. Hair was paramount. Attendants oiled, curled, and arranged it into elaborate styles that mirrored fashions worn by Roman women of the elite. Free-born men often mocked such adornments as effeminate, but for a concubine these styles were expected. To wear one's hair in curls, to have it perfumed with myrrh or saffron, was to signal availability. The boy's head became a canvas, his locks sculpted into the shape of another's desire. The body, too, required constant care. Pumice stones scraped away hair and roughness, leaving skin unnaturally smooth. Slaves plucked eyebrows and applied ointments to delay growth. White lead powder whitened the complexion, antimony darkened the eyes, and vermilion painted the lips. To modern understanding, these cosmetics were dangerous, filled with toxins that damaged the body over time. But in Rome, they were symbols of refinement, as essential as a silk tunic or a golden cup. Perfume completed the illusion. Imported at staggering expense from Arabia, India, or Egypt, fragrances were dabbed onto the neck and wrists, turning the boy into a living vessel of exotic luxury. To carry such scents was not only to please the senses, but to advertise the wealth of the master. Each drop of frankincense or cinnamon oil whispered of caravans crossing deserts, of ships braving stormy seas, all culminating in the body of a single enslaved youth. Diet was another instrument of beauty. Some masters demanded slimness, enforcing restricted meals of fruits, nuts, and watered wine. Others preferred plumpness, a sign of prosperity, and force-fed boys to achieve rounder cheeks and softer flesh. Physicians like Cyrenus of Ephesus wrote of herbs meant to delay puberty or soften the voice, while others prescribed bloodletting to maintain a pallid complexion. Every detail of the body became a matter of control, calibrated to preserve the illusion of eternal youth. This routine consumed hours each day. The boy's mornings were not his own. They belonged to the brushes, oils, powders, and razors wielded by attendants. Yet these rituals, while painful, were also paradoxically protective. A concubine who failed to maintain his appearance risked sale or punishment. To be beautiful was to survive another day in a world where desirability equaled security. And yet, beneath the sheen of cosmetics, the body bore its scars. Burns from harsh depilatories made with quicklime, infections from plucked follicles, fatigue from constant fasting or purging. Roman medical texts, clinical and detached, listed remedies for anal fissures or chronic pain, as though they were treating soldiers' wounds. The concubine's body was both stage and battlefield, refined for display, while quietly breaking under the weight of maintenance. What made these rituals so insidious was how they blurred exploitation into elegance. To guests at the banquet, the concubine's appearance seemed effortless, a vision of youthful beauty. Few considered the hours of pain, the endless grooming, the silent endurance that sustained the performance. Rome admired the finished statue, never the chiseling that produced it. And so each morning the concubine became his own mask, painted, perfumed, perfected. To survive meant to submit to the ritual, to transform flesh into ornament, person into performance. And as the mirror reflected back the painted face, the boy saw not himself, but the role he was forced to play, polished until no trace of childhood remained. For every concubine, the shadow of time hung heavier than chains. Unlike field laborers or household servants, whose value might increase with skill or strength, the delicatus was bound to a single, fleeting currency: youth. Every morning of grooming, every banquet where he stood, adorned in silk, was also one step closer to decline. In Rome, beauty was both shield and sentence, for it expired quickly, and when it did, the consequences were merciless. At first, the signs were subtle, the jawline sharpening, the voice deepening, the skin losing its softness. For the boy himself, these changes marked the natural passage into adulthood. For his master, they were signals that the investment was nearing exhaustion. The paradox was cruel. His survival had depended on a body that was never meant to remain unchanged. When a concubine aged out, his future splintered into uncertain paths. Some, if fortunate, transitioned into trusted household roles: secretary, accountant, tutor to younger slaves. Their training in literature or mathematics might find new purpose, though never true independence. Others, less lucky, were sold to brothels, condemned to lives of relentless exploitation until sickness or exhaustion consumed them. And for many, the fate was worse still: resale into brutal labor in quarries or mines, where life expectancy was measured in months. Masters sometimes sought to forestall this decline with desperate measures. Medical texts mention herbs to delay beard growth, concoctions to soften the voice, diets to maintain youthful proportions. But nature could not be indefinitely restrained. A concubine might be preserved for a few years, perhaps until 18 or 19, but rarely longer. His body became a vanishing commodity, slipping out of the category that once protected him, even as that protection had always been a gilded prison. For those who transitioned into new roles, survival often depended on their ability to reinvent themselves without threatening their master's authority. A concubine who became too ambitious risked punishment or exile from the household. Even as a secretary or steward, he remained forever marked by his past. Roman society did not forget the role a man had once played, and whispers of shame followed him long after his beauty had faded. Occasionally, a concubine earned freedom. A master, out of affection or guilt, might grant manumission, allowing him to live as a freedman. Yet even this supposed liberation was often conditional. Legal documents sometimes included clauses requiring continued companionship, a thin veil for ongoing sexual access. Others stipulated loyalty, ensuring that the freedman remained tethered to the household that had once owned him. Freedom, when it came, was seldom clean. The psychological toll of this inevitability cannot be overstated. From the moment of purchase, a concubine lived with the knowledge that his worth would vanish with age. Every compliment from a guest, every touch from a master, carried the unspoken reminder that it would one day cease. And when it did, what remained was uncertainty, whether the next chapter would mean survival, humiliation, or death. Rome itself seemed indifferent to these transitions. To its citizens, the disappearance of one concubine simply meant the appearance of another. The market was always stocked, wars and raids always supplied new faces. The cycle continued, generation after generation, each boy stepping into the role of those who had aged out before him. It is here, perhaps, that the cruelty of the system reveals itself most starkly. A gladiator might at least dream of victory, a field slave of endurance. But for the delicatus, the end was always written from the beginning. To be chosen was not salvation, but postponement, a reprieve that led only to obsolescence. The silks, the perfumes, the songs, all of it was preparation for a decline that could never be avoided. And so, when the first grey morning arrived, where the boy's reflection no longer matched the mask he had worn, the truth became undeniable. He had been valued not as a human, but as a season. And like all seasons, his time was destined to end. Rome prided itself on its laws. The 12 tables, the great codices of later emperors, the endless writings of jurists, all proclaimed that the empire was a civilization governed by order, by rules, by justice. And yet when we examine how the law touched the lives of concubines, we find not protection, but the opposite. A labyrinth of loopholes that ensured exploitation could flourish while appearing regulated. Take, for instance, the issue of castration. Under Domitian's edict of 83 AD, it was formally illegal to castrate a slave within Roman territory. On parchment, the law seemed a moral stand, but reality undermined it instantly. Slave traders simply imported pre-castrated boys from beyond the borders, Syrian, Phrygian, or Cappadocian children who had already been altered to suit Roman demand. Jurists could debate the limits of legality, but the practice continued, driven by appetite and profit. The law had not closed the door, it had merely redirected the path. Similarly, contracts of sale often contained specific clauses. A boy sold with the ene serva prostituatur condition, that is, not to be forced into prostitution, was, in theory, shielded from brothels, but enforcement was nearly impossible. Who would testify on behalf of a slave? Who would challenge a master's word? A single accusation could be dismissed as insolence, punished as rebellion. The ink on the contract mattered far less than the power in the household. Roman jurists did write extensively about the categories of servitude. They debated whether a concubine could inherit property if granted a peculium, a kind of personal fund technically still owned by the master. They discussed whether a freed concubine could marry a freeborn citizen. They even considered whether cruelty that led to a slave's suicide counted as loss of property that should be compensated. Each argument reveals the same truth. Slaves were not people in the eyes of the law. They were objects, res, whose value could be calculated in coin, not dignity. The silence of the law is often the loudest evidence. Nowhere in the codes do we find concepts that to us seem foundational: consent, childhood, protection from sexual violence. These words, these ideas, did not exist in the Roman legal framework when applied to slaves. A master's sexual access was absolute, regardless of the slave's age or will. To legislate otherwise would have undermined the very foundation of Roman slavery, and so the law simply ignored it. What makes this all the more striking is Rome's obsession with legality in other matters. Property boundaries, inheritance disputes, commercial contracts, all were treated with meticulous care. But when the property in question was a human being, the law bent itself to accommodate the desires of the owner. In this, Roman society revealed its priorities with crystalline clarity: commerce before compassion, control before justice. Even the reforms that later emperors introduced were riddled with exceptions. Constantine, in the 4th century, issued laws against the prostitution of children, yet explicitly exempted enslaved children, whose exploitation continued unchecked. Justinian, in the 6th century, finally banned the sexual use of child slaves in theory, but by then the empire's machinery of enforcement had grown weak, and the ban remained more moral gesture than lived reality. For the concubine, the law was not shield, but shadow. It loomed over him as a system that recorded his sale, calculated his value, and justified his use, but never once acknowledged his suffering. Every statute, every edict, every carefully worded clause served to reinforce the master's power. And if loopholes appeared, it was not accident, but design. The irony is painful. Rome, a civilization that celebrated itself as the pinnacle of legal thought, perfected a system in which legality became the most efficient servant of exploitation. Where law should have offered protection, it offered paperwork. Where justice should have spoken, it remained silent. Thus the concubine lived in a world where cruelty was not lawless, it was entirely lawful. And perhaps this is the darkest truth, that atrocity does not always thrive in chaos. More often, it hides within order, sanctioned not by silence, but by the steady scratch of a jurist's pen. If Roman law rendered concubines as property, Roman poetry often disguised them as objects of devotion. Literature has always had the power to reshape perception, to take raw violence and wrap it in verse until cruelty sounds like beauty. In Rome, Poets played this role with unsettling skill. Catullus and Tibullus wrote tender lines that seemed to celebrate love, but in context revealed the distorted framework of possession. The concubine became muse, ornament, sometimes even substitute for mythic figures like Ganymede, the Trojan boy abducted by Zeus to serve as his cupbearer and beloved. By invoking myth, the poets gave divine legitimacy to what was, in reality, institutional exploitation. To compare a boy to Ganymede was to imply that the gods themselves approved of such arrangements. Statius, a poet of the late 1st century, went so far as to compose an elaborate consolation for a nobleman whose concubine had died. In that poem, the boy is likened to a flower plucked too soon, a star dimmed before its time, a soul claimed by the gods out of jealousy. On the surface, the verses seem tender, even mournful, but beneath the imagery lies the same chilling fact. The boy's death mattered because he was beautiful property lost, not because he was a human life extinguished. These works functioned as propaganda, not in the political sense of speeches or decrees, but in the cultural sense of normalizing desire. By couching exploitation in the language of affection, poetry allowed masters to see themselves not as abusers, but as lovers, patrons, even mourners. The verses softened violence into romance, obscuring the imbalance of power with images of sweetness and grief. Petronius, in his Satyricon, described banquets where boys stood nude beside couches, ready to serve wine or respond to guests' whims. Yet he presented this not as outrage, but as humor, satire aimed at excess rather than empathy for the enslaved. The concubine appears again and again in Roman literature, but always as backdrop, as symbol, as ornament, never as voice. The cultural impact of such writing was immense. For the Roman elite, poetry was not mere entertainment, but a marker of education and refinement. To quote Virgil at dinner, to recite Catullus in the bath, was to demonstrate cultivation. And when those verses praised or romanticized the concubine, they reinforced the idea that such relationships were not only acceptable, but beautiful. Verse became validation, art became alibi. It is here that we see perhaps the most insidious layer of Roman exploitation, the transformation of pain into aesthetics. The boy who was plucked, painted, and paraded at banquets also lived within the lines of poems recited for centuries, his suffering immortalized not as tragedy, but as decoration. The same Rome that broke his body also celebrated him in elegy, turning silence into song, but always from the master's perspective. And so, while the law reduced concubines to property, the poets reduced them to metaphor. Both stripped away voice, both erased the lived reality. What remained was a polished surface, contracts on one side, verses on the other, behind which lay the unrecorded truth that affection, when filtered through ownership, is only another mask for power. In the banquet halls of Rome, wealth was not whispered but shouted. It gleamed in golden cups, shimmered in silk-draped couches, and, most strikingly, stood silently in the form of living bodies. Concubines were not kept in shadows, they were placed at the very center of spectacle. To own a delicatus was to own proof that one's fortune and refinement surpassed that of others. At dinner parties, boys hovered near their masters' couches, holding perfumed towels, pouring wine with practiced grace, fanning guests as though they themselves were part of the evening's entertainment. Martial, the sharp-tongued poet of the 1st century, sneered that at some feasts concubines were passed between guests like drinking cups. To the elite, this was not scandal, but status. The boy's very availability broadcast the host's power to command beauty at will. The theatre, too, became another stage for possession. When masters attended plays or gladiatorial games, concubines sat not among the audience, but at their master's feet, visible to all. Their role was to be seen, their presence a declaration. Here is a man so wealthy he can adorn even his leisure with human ornaments. In these moments, the concubine's body was less a companion than a trophy, an embodied advertisement of luxury. Festivals intensified this display. During Saturnalia, the holiday, when roles supposedly inverted and slaves were granted a fleeting semblance of freedom, concubines often bore the heaviest burdens. Masters hosted elaborate parties, and the delicatus became the centerpiece of laughter, music, and indulgence. At the Floralia, a festival celebrating Flora, goddess of flowers and youthful beauty, concubines might be forced to perform dances, sometimes nude, in front of roaring crowds. What was framed as celebration of fertility and life often became an arena of humiliation. Even in religious rituals, concubines were not spared. Some masters specified in their wills that favorite concubines should accompany them into death, sacrificed at the funeral pyre. Though officially banned by the Senate in 11 AD, whispers suggest the practice persisted in secret, a final assertion of ownership that extended beyond the grave. What is striking in all this is the way public visibility was woven into the role. A concubine was never merely a private indulgence, he was a statement of social standing. To maintain such a boy required enormous expense, not only for purchase, but for clothing, education, perfume, and constant maintenance. Displaying him was the point. Just as a villa's frescoes and fountains reflected the grandeur of its owner, so too did the presence of a silk-clad youth standing silently in a corner, radiating beauty that belonged to another. This dynamic reveals something profound about Roman society. Status was not just about possession, it was about possession made visible. It was not enough to own wealth, one had to perform it. And in that performance, concubines became stage props in the theatre of Roman prestige. They were at once elevated above other slaves and reduced beneath them, given silks but denied self, placed at the center of attention yet stripped of voice. For the boy himself, such visibility was double-edged. To be seen meant security, his role was valuable, his presence required, but to be seen also meant exposure. Every eye in the banquet hall could assess, desire, or mock him. Every guest could reach out a hand, and refusal was never an option. Invisibility was impossible, privacy unthinkable. His life was a performance without intermission, staged on the marble floors of Rome's wealthiest homes. Thus, the concubine's existence was a paradox of elevation and erasure. He embodied beauty and refinement, yet only as a reflection of another's power. He was placed in the brightest light, yet his own humanity remained in shadow. Rome adored the spectacle, but it was a spectacle built upon silence. Behind the glitter of silk and the shimmer of perfumes, another economy operated quietly in the world of concubines. An economy not of coins alone, but of favors, gifts, and subtle manipulations. For while the concubine was property, utterly subject to his master's will, he was also positioned close enough to power to bend its edges, if only slightly, for his own survival. The legal system offered one small crack, the peculium. Technically, any property a slave possessed still belonged to the master. But in practice, many concubines were allowed to control small sums of money, or to accumulate jewelry, trinkets, or even land rights given as gifts. A ring offered by a senator after a banquet, a necklace slipped discreetly into a palm, a purse of coins pressed in secret, all became tools of leverage. A clever boy learned to nurture admiration not only from his master, but from his master's guests, carefully collecting tokens that might later be bartered for security. Some concubines developed reputations as skilled manipulators, balancing multiple admirers to secure streams of gifts. A silver mirror, a finely carved comb, a vial of imported perfume, each object was more than decoration. It was an anchor, a small foothold in a life otherwise dictated by others. There are scattered records of concubines who, through years of careful accumulation, gathered enough wealth to purchase their own freedom. Yet even this success was precarious. Manumission documents often included clauses requiring continued sexual availability, proving that even liberty could remain shackled. But survival was not always about wealth. It could mean simply softening the master's temper, learning when to speak and when to remain silent, when to feign affection and when to display trembling obedience. Some concubines became experts in reading moods, diffusing anger with a smile, or redirecting cruelty with a well-timed verse. These were not acts of love, but of calculation. Each gesture of charm was a negotiation for tomorrow. At times, concubines formed alliances with other slaves in the household. A kitchen servant might slip them extra food, a doorkeeper might carry a message. These bonds, fragile though they were, created a network of small protections. Yet they also bred resentment. Other slaves, forced into brutal labor without the silks or perfumes of the delicatus, often envied the concubine's privileges, forgetting or perhaps unwilling to see that such privileges were poisoned. Some concubines even navigated their way into positions of influence, whispering advice to masters during moments of intimacy or shaping decisions at banquets through subtle suggestions. Roman gossip occasionally records instances where the favor of a concubine swayed politics in the household, though such power was always dangerous. To appear too influential risked jealousy, not only from legitimate wives and children, but from rivals within the master's circle. And so the hidden economy was never secure. A concubine might rise for a moment, showered with gifts, praised for wit and beauty, protected by affection. But with a single shift in fortune, a master's boredom, a guest's insult, the arrival of a younger slave, everything could vanish. What had been gathered through years of delicate maneuvering could be lost in an instant. Still, these small strategies mattered. They gave concubines a way, however limited, to assert fragments of agency in a world designed to deny them. Each gift tucked away, each coin hidden, each alliance whispered in shadows was an act of quiet resistance against complete erasure. They could not control the rules of Rome's cruel economy, but within its margins they carved out their own fragile space for survival. No matter how carefully a concubine was adorned with perfume and silk, his body told the truth. Beneath the powders and jewels lay the consequences of constant use, of forced performances that strained both flesh and spirit. Illness was a constant shadow, and despair often followed close behind. Roman physicians like Galen and Celsus wrote of treatments for the delicate ones, their texts revealing both clinical detachment and profound misunderstanding. Galen attributed the ailments of concubines to excessive moisture of temperament, as if suffering could be explained by humors rather than harm. He described treating youths for what modern medicine recognizes as sexually transmitted infections, though he never acknowledged the cause as repeated exploitation. Celsus recommended wine and olive oil for tears and injuries, as though fine ingredients could mask agony. The body bore the brunt of this system. Anal fissures, rectal prolapse, chronic pain, all appear in medical records as though they were as ordinary as coughs or fevers. Suppositories laced with astringents were prescribed to restore tightness, a phrase that reveals far more than the physicians likely intended. Some concubines became dependent on opium or heavy wine to dull the constant ache, addictions encouraged by masters who found intoxicated slaves easier to control. Cosmetic practices also carved their own wounds. Quicklime-based depilatories burned skin, lead-based powders poisoned blood, herbs intended to delay puberty disrupted natural growth. A boy might look polished under lamplight, but beneath the surface his body was deteriorating, weakened by the very rituals meant to preserve him. And yet the cruelties of the body were only half the torment. The mind suffered equally, though Roman texts, bound by their cultural silence, rarely named it. Depression was described as melancholic disposition. Anxiety appeared in vague phrases about nervous exhaustion. But modern eyes can see clearly these boys lived under relentless trauma. To be constantly watched, touched, judged, and reshaped was to live without rest. Suicide, tragically, was not rare. Seneca, in his cold pragmatism, advised masters to keep rope and sharp objects away from concubines, not to protect them, but to protect the investment. Poison was a frequent fear, not only that concubines might take their own lives, but that in moments of desperation they might slip toxins into their master's cup. Rumors whispered that Claudius's concubine Halotus had delivered the poisoned mushrooms that killed the emperor, though history leaves the truth uncertain. Despair often took quieter forms. Some concubines feigned illness to avoid duties, clinging to even a day of reprieve. Others starved themselves slowly, their bodies wasting away under the guise of fragility. A few sought solace in secret friendships with other slaves, whispering comfort in darkened corners, creating emotional refugees that the system could not fully erase. But for many, despair was endured in silence. The painted lips smiled at banquets, the trained voice recited verses, the perfumed body stood at attention, all while inside the soul eroded. Rome demanded performance even from suffering, and so anguish itself became invisible. Perhaps this is the most devastating truth. The concubine's illness was not considered tragedy, but inconvenience. His pain mattered only insofar as it interrupted service. His despair was not a warning to society, but a problem to be managed. And so he lived and died as Rome required, polished on the outside, broken within, another body consumed in the name of beauty and power. If illness and despair gnawed from within, then violence came crashing from without. For a concubine, there was no corner of Roman society free from the threat of cruelty. Masters, mistresses, legitimate children, even fellow slaves, all could strike, humiliate, or destroy him, and often did. The master's hand was the most obvious danger. To displease him was to invite punishment. A spilled cup of wine, a misplaced verse, a glance held too long could result in a slap, a beating, or worse. Violence was not only corrective, but performative. At banquets, a blow delivered in front of guests could reinforce the master's authority, reminding all that even the most beautiful ornament in the room remained property. The very intimacy that gave a concubine privilege also made him vulnerable to sudden wrath. Mistresses and wives were another source of torment. Jealousy is an ancient emotion, and Roman matrons, though often excluded from formal power, wielded authority within the household. A concubine was a rival intruder, a constant reminder of a husband's infidelity sanctioned by law. Some wives lashed out directly, ordering beatings, cutting hair, or orchestrating humiliations. Others wielded subtler cruelty, poisoning reputations, ensuring the boy was sent away or sold. Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, was said to have arranged the deaths of several of her husband's favorites under fabricated charges. Such stories reveal not only her power, but the precarity of a concubine's position in the domestic battlefield. Legitimate children, too, could direct violence downward. Sons of the household might mock or torment concubines, exercising the privilege they inherited by birth. Daughters, resentful of the attention diverted from themselves or their mothers, might lash out in scorn. The concubine was always the outsider, tolerated yet despised, elevated yet despised. He was the ornament that glittered while simultaneously corroding the pride of those around him. Even among slaves who shared chains of servitude, resentment brewed. Field hands and household laborers saw the concubine clothed in silk, eating delicacies, enjoying proximity to the master. To them he appeared privileged, a favourite. Envy sharpened into cruelty, for they could mock him without risking much. After all, if he fought back, it was he who would be punished. The concubine occupied a paradoxical place in the hierarchy, envied by the enslaved, despised by the free, never safe from either. The violence was not always physical. Words could wound as deeply as whips. Poets mocked concubines as effeminate. Satirists ridiculed them as symbols of decadence. To the Roman street they were at once objects of fascination and contempt. The jeers of passers-by, the snickers of guests at banquets, the whispers of rivals in the household, all became a constant chorus reminding the boy of his role as both ornament and outcast. And yet, the most chilling truth is that this violence was not aberration, but expectation. Rome normalized cruelty so thoroughly that no one questioned it. Masters believed themselves benevolent if they refrained from excessive beatings. Wives justified their spite as defense of honor. Other slaves consoled themselves with the thought that at least their suffering was honest, unadorned, unlike the perfumed torment of the concubine. Every hand that struck him believed the blow legitimate. This relentless exposure to hostility left no refuge. The villa, the banquet hall, the streets of Rome, each space carried its own dangers. The concubine's beauty made him valuable, but also made him a target. He lived in the center of attention, yet without protection, surrounded by admiration laced with contempt. Thus, violence did not simply erupt, it seeped from every direction, saturating daily life. For the concubine, survival meant not only performing beauty, but navigating a world where every gaze, every word, every gesture could pivot without warning into cruelty. His body bore the bruises, his spirit bore the scars, and both told the story of a life lived as possession in a society that saw possession as natural. Among all the stories of concubinage in Rome, one rises above the others, not because it was typical, but because it was exceptional. It is the story of Antinous, the Bithynian youth whose beauty captured the heart of an emperor, and whose death transformed him into something more than human. His tale is remembered not as a tragedy of obscurity, but as a legend of love and loss, etched into stone and myth. Antinous was a Greek boy from Bithynia in Asia Minor, likely purchased or given as part of the networks of servitude that fed Rome's elite. Around 123 AD, he entered the circle of Emperor Hadrian. What began as companionship soon grew into something far deeper. Ancient sources differ in detail, but all agree. Hadrian adored him. The emperor took Antinous on imperial tours, paraded him before governors and kings, and allowed him a presence usually reserved for family. Unlike the countless anonymous concubines scattered across the empire, Antinous became visible, known, recorded, remembered. Their relationship culminated in tragedy on the Nile in 130 AD. Antinous drowned under mysterious circumstances. Some whispered accident, others ritual sacrifice, still others murder. What is certain is Hadrian's reaction. He was inconsolable. The emperor, ruler of the known world, wept openly, defying Roman ideals of stoic masculinity. His grief was so profound that he ordered Antinous deified, worshipped as a god throughout the empire. Cities were founded in his name, statues carved his likeness in marble, his face serene, youthful, immortalized. For Rome, this was unprecedented. Never before had an emperor elevated a boy from servitude into divinity. For the common concubine, the story must have seemed like a distant dream, one of their own raised to the heavens, his beauty no longer a private possession, but a godly ideal. Yet the uniqueness of Antinous only underscores the ordinary fate of others. His divinization was not a reflection of the system's kindness, but of Hadrian's personal obsession. Most concubines remained nameless, their deaths unnoticed, their faces unrecorded. The cult of Antinous spread rapidly, blending Greek and Egyptian traditions with Roman politics. To some, he became a symbol of youthful beauty preserved beyond death. To others, he embodied a form of sacred sacrifice, a boy offered so that an emperor might continue to thrive. Shrines rose in his honor, coins bore his profile, and prayers invoked his name. His memory became both consolation and propaganda, a divine youth who reflected Hadrian's grief and Rome's fascination with beauty, elevated to eternity. Yet beneath the marble calm of his statues lies a more haunting question. Was Antinous' death voluntary or demanded? Did he choose the Nile to preserve his youth forever, or was he chosen, compelled by forces far larger than himself? Ancient whispers of ritual suggest that Hadrian's astrologers or priests advised the sacrifice of a beloved to prolong the emperor's life. If so, then even Antinous, elevated to godhood, remained bound by the same cruel logic that governed every concubine. His body, his life, his very existence were never his own. The story of Antinous lingers because it complicates our understanding of concubinage. It shows how love, genuine and devastating, could coexist with ownership. Hadrian's grief was real, his devotion undeniable. Yet the very foundation of their bond remained unequal. Antinous was adored, but he was never free. Even his immortality was granted not by his own will, but by the emperor who claimed him in life and sanctified him in death. In remembering Antinous, we are reminded of the countless others whose names have vanished. For every statue carved in marble, there were thousands of boys who left no trace. Antinous became a god, but most concubines died as shadows. His story shines brightly, not because it was typical, but because it was rare, a single star against a night sky filled with forgotten faces. In Rome, sexuality and slavery intertwined so completely that the boundaries between household, lineage, and inheritance were often blurred. Concubines, though usually young men chosen for beauty and refinement, did not exist in isolation. They lived in households full of other slaves, women, children, laborers, and from these interactions arose an often overlooked reality: the children born of concubinage. Roman masters rarely confined their desires to one category of slave. They used women and men alike, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. While the system assumed concubines were chosen for pleasure and display, it did not prevent them from fathering children with enslaved women. In fact, such unions were sometimes encouraged by masters who sought to breed future generations of desirable servants. A child born of a beautiful concubine and a female slave might inherit features that increased his or her value on the market. In this way, even reproduction was commodified. The body of the concubine turned into a tool of eugenics long before the word existed. For the children themselves, life began already determined by status. Born of enslaved parents, they were slaves by law, regardless of their father's favor or mother's position. If the child was considered attractive, the cycle repeated: grooming for beauty, training for service, perhaps selected for concubinage themselves. If not, they were sent to fields, kitchens, or workshops, their parentage erased in the machinery of Roman labor. The presence of children created complex, hidden family networks within households. Concubines sometimes formed bonds with the women they were forced to sleep with, ties that blurred the line between coerced union and fragile companionship. A boy might whisper promises of protection to a woman equally powerless, sharing what little comfort he could. When children came, they became both joy and burden. To love them was to risk heartbreak, for at any moment they could be sold, separated or forced into the same cycle of exploitation. Masters, of course, viewed these offspring as assets. A child born within the household was one less purchase required at the market. Records from Egyptian papyri show children listed alongside livestock and tools in estate inventories, valued for their potential labor or beauty. Some masters even boasted of breeding house-born slaves as proof of wealth and management, as though raising human chattel were equivalent to cultivating vineyards. There were, rarely, exceptions. A particularly favored concubine might persuade his master to grant manumission to a child or even to the mother. In still rarer cases, children of concubines were raised alongside legitimate heirs, though always marked by stigma. Roman society never let them forget their origins, and whispers of illegitimacy could poison a family's reputation for generations. For the concubine himself, children were both mirror and chain. To see one's own son or daughter enslaved was to confront the endlessness of the system, that even blood could not break the cycle. Yet for some, children also provided a fragile anchor of meaning. In the hidden corners of the villa between duties and humiliations, a father might find moments of tenderness, teaching a child a fragment of poetry, sneaking food from the banquet table, watching small hands trace patterns in the dust. These moments, fleeting and easily erased, were acts of resistance against total dehumanization. Still, the system swallowed most of these stories whole. Few names survive, few details recorded. The children of concubines existed in the shadows, their lives dictated before they could speak, their futures chained to the desires of others. In them we see the cruel efficiency of Roman slavery, not only to consume the bodies of the present, but to ensure the bodies of the future were already bound. Rome was not one city, but an empire, stretching from the cold rains of Britain to the deserts of Egypt, from the forests of Germania to the marble temples of Greece. And while the system of concubinage carried the same brutal logic everywhere, youth as currency, beauty as commodity, its expression varied across provinces, shaped by local traditions, cultures, and economies. In Greece, where pederastic traditions had long existed before Roman conquest, concubinage merged with older customs. Greek boys, especially those educated in gymnasia, were prized for their association with Hellenic ideals of beauty and refinement. Romans, eager to emulate Greek culture while asserting dominance over it, eagerly purchased them. In Athens, Corinth, and Delos, markets buzzed with traders offering youths whose features matched classical ideals: proportioned bodies, graceful movement, the kind of elegance celebrated in sculpture. To Romans, owning a Greek delicatus was not just indulgence, but proof of sophistication. Egypt offered a different dynamic. There, priestly families, struggling under heavy taxes and declining local power, sometimes sold their children into Roman households. Egyptian concubines often carried with them not only physical beauty, but fragments of religious and cultural knowledge. Some scholars suggest that Eastern mystery cults like those of Isis or Mithras gained footholds in Rome through the enslaved children who whispered their rights in the ears of masters. In this sense, concubinage became not only a system of exploitation, but also an inadvertent conduit of cultural transmission. In Gaul and Germania, Roman conquerors targeted the sons of defeated warriors. These boys, with their fair hair and strong builds, were praised for a supposed blend of barbarian vigor and youthful beauty. Roman poets described them in exotic terms, emphasizing their strangeness while indulging in their desirability. Yet the brutality of their transition was profound. One day, sons of tribal elites, the next reduced to ornaments in Roman villas, their freedom stripped along with their identity. Britain, newly conquered in 43 AD, at first supplied few concubines. Roman traders dismissed its children as crude, too rough for the refinements of delicacy. But as Roman influence spread northward, Even British boys entered the markets, their features reinterpreted through Roman ideals. By the 2nd century, inscriptions suggest they had become part of the same cycle, their origins erased in the uniform language of commerce. Each region added its own texture to the system, but the pattern remained consistent. Conquest fed the markets. War produced surges of enslaved children, lowering prices temporarily. Famines drove desperate families to sell offspring. Trade routes ensured a steady supply from the edges of empire to the marble villas at its heart. The empire was a vast machine, and concubines were one of its commodities, flowing alongside grain, wine, and silk. These variations remind us of the sheer reach of Roman exploitation. A Syrian boy might stand beside a Greek one at a banquet in Rome. An Egyptian youth might serve wine while a Gallic child played the flute. Together they embodied not diversity but domination, the power of Rome to strip every culture of its sons, to mold them into ornaments for the empire's elite. And yet, in subtle ways, they also carried their homelands with them. The songs they learned as children, the accents of their first words, the prayers whispered in secret. These fragments of origin sometimes survived. They may have taught a master a foreign tune, recited a story of their gods, or simply carried themselves with the bearing of their people. Even as Rome sought to erase them, pieces of Greece, Egypt, Gaul, and Britain slipped into the empire's veins through these stolen bodies. Thus, concubinage was not only a Roman institution, but an imperial one, absorbing the conquered into its cruel intimacy. It was both symbol and symptom of Rome's reach, how the empire extended its hand into every province, not only to tax its land and take its soldiers, but to claim the most fragile possession of all, its children. Though their voices are lost, concubines left traces, faint, fragmented, often distorted through the perspectives of masters and bureaucrats. To modern eyes, these fragments are devastating, for they show how fully human lives were reduced to items of record, marks on papyrus, scratches on stone. The Egyptian papyri are among the most revealing. In estate records, concubines appear listed alongside cattle, grain, and tools. One contract from Oxyrhynchus describes 3 brothers who jointly owned a Syrian boy, rotating his service month by month as though he were farm equipment. Another document details a lawsuit over a rented concubine. The renter argued that the boy had pre-existing defects, a chilling phrase that stripped away humanity until nothing remained but the logic of commerce. These papers, mundane in tone, reveal the full extent of commodification. Youth sold, shared, mortgaged, and inherited like any other asset. Graffiti tells another story, etched not by scribes but by ordinary hands. In Pompeii, walls preserve names, crude drawings, even tally marks that may have counted days. Some inscriptions appear to be signatures, perhaps left in secret by boys who wanted proof that they had existed beyond the role forced upon them. Others are fragments of jokes or insults, likely written by fellow slaves or passing citizens. These scratches, though ambiguous, whisper of endurance, of lives pushing against erasure. Archaeology adds a different dimension. In villas at Pompeii and Herculaneum, frescoes and mosaics depict boys serving wine, reclining in poses of mythological seduction, or playing flutes. These images, preserved by volcanic ash, present an idealized vision: perfected beauty, eternal youth, silence without suffering. Yet when compared with skeletal remains unearthed nearby, the contrast is stark. The bones of adolescents show signs of malnutrition, repetitive stress injuries, and even fractures from beatings. The art reveals how Romans wanted to see concubines. The bones reveal what they truly endured. Personal belongings unearthed in slave quarters carry a quieter resonance. Archaeologists have found small mirrors, bone hairpins, wooden combs, even tiny clay figurines. To the master, these were trifles. To the slave, they may have been treasures, objects of identity, memory, or hope. A mirror might reflect not only a painted face, but also a fleeting glimpse of self. A figurine, carved crudely, might echo a god of home long lost. These artifacts remind us that even in lives reduced to possession, fragments of humanity persisted. Funerary inscriptions too occasionally name concubines, but the language is formulaic, more revealing of the master's grief than the slave's life. One epitaph compares a dead boy to Ganymede, another praises his beauty taken too soon by the gods. Rarely do these stones mention personal desires, thoughts, or family. The concubine appears as a reflection of his owner's sorrow, never his own. Death, like life, was filtered through the lens of possession. Taken together, these documents and artifacts paint a chilling picture. Concubines existed everywhere in the empire, yet nowhere as individuals. They appear in ledgers, contracts, frescoes, and bones, evidence of presence without voice, of lives measured in coin, of beauty recorded only when it served another's purpose. And yet, these traces matter. They remind us that the concubines were real, that they walked marble floors, laughed in stolen moments, scratched words into plaster, held small objects close to their hearts. Rome sought to consume and erase them, but fragments survived, just enough for us to glimpse the humanity beneath the silence, the life beneath the commodity. The silence of the concubines lingers across centuries. Their names are mostly lost, their voices erased, their bodies consumed and discarded by a civilization that celebrated its own refinement while masking its cruelties in law, poetry, and ritual. And yet in that very silence we find a profound warning. Rome, after all, did not see itself as monstrous. Its citizens believed they were heirs of reason, builders of order, defenders of libertas. The abuse of concubines was not considered crime or scandal, but custom, woven into the fabric of society so tightly that few questioned it. A master who wept for a lost boy believed his grief genuine, even as he prepared to purchase another. A poet who compared a concubine to Ganymede thought himself inspired, not complicit. Atrocity was not hidden, it was normalized, made invisible by being everywhere. That normalization is what should disturb us most. History does not repeat, but it echoes. Today, when we read of human trafficking, of children forced into labor or sexual exploitation, the patterns are hauntingly familiar. Families still sell children in desperation, laws still exist, but fail to protect the most vulnerable. Societies still romanticize or look away from exploitation when it is convenient. Technologies change, languages shift, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. Rome's concubines are not relics of a distant past, they are mirrors held up to the present. This recognition demands humility. Archaeology, medicine, and law can tell us fragments of what concubines endured, but they cannot restore their voices. The poetry that praised them, the contracts that recorded them, the frescoes that depicted them, all reflect the perspective of those who owned them, never of those who lived as them. To speak of concubines today is to attempt the impossible, to imagine lives deliberately silenced. Yet even in acknowledging this, we resist the erasure Rome intended. There is also responsibility. Museums display Roman statues of flawless youths, but rarely mention the enslaved children who inspired them. Popular culture romanticizes Rome's grandeur, while ignoring the suffering that underpinned it. To tell the story honestly is to reinsert the concubine into history, not as ornament, but as human, not as symbol, but as voice. Commemoration remains largely absent. No monuments stand for them, no days of remembrance mark their pain. Perhaps they deserve both. In the end, the story of Roman concubinage is not just about Rome. It is about us, about the human capacity to turn exploitation into spectacle, to transform violence into beauty, to normalize what should horrify. Each morning that a concubine awoke to the cold touch of marble, he lived out the paradox of civilization, that brilliance and brutality, refinement and cruelty often walk hand in hand. And so we return to the villa where our story began. The chains shift faintly, the light filters coldly through high windows, and a boy rises to serve again. 2,000 years have passed, but his shadow still lingers. He reminds us that civilization is not measured by marble or law, but by how it treats the most vulnerable. And he asks us silently but insistently to look at our own world with unflinching eyes. History does not absolve, it warns. And in the warning lies its deepest purpose, to ensure that the silences of the past do not become the silences of our present.